All right. So in front of me here is a different keyboard. This is my Lily58, and you can see that it's a split ergonomic keyboard, but you can also see that it comes with a neat little screen that actually tells you what kind of keyboard it is. This keyboard kind of falls in the hobbyist category. There's not necessarily a real vendor that builds this. You can find people who will build this for you, but it's not like there's a company behind it. I believe this is an open source design that, you can buy the PCB, you can solder the whole thing yourself. Now, the way that I got this, I didn't do my own soldering on this one. I went to this website called Marktplaats. It's Dutch eBay, basically. And I actually found someone who was selling like 5 of these. And after asking, turns out that this is someone who likes to solder and is kind of a hobby, and. So that also kind of meant I was able to get a pretty good deal for this. I had my own switches, but I just paid for the keycaps and, a pretty reasonable 3D printed case and all the soldering. And that was like easy below 200 bucks. And when I got this, it basically had many of the bells and whistles included. There's like the software was flashed, so I can use VIAL to program this thing in a GUI. I'll show you that in a bit. But I think one of the more interesting things about the way that this particular Lily is set up, and I'm unplugging it now, is this extra thing I bought on top. So there is this website called 3dkeycap. But from that website, you can buy a Lily tilting kit. And you can very clearly see it when I show it like this. You can see that the switches actually have a thing on top, and that has allowed me to increase the height and add an angle for some of these switches. And when you add all those things together, you kind of get this key well kind of a thing. I don't use the layout that they gave me in the kit. I kind of made my own with it. But the main thing that you can see is that if I put my hands in the resting position here, let's see if I can get the angle right. If I move my fingers up, it's not like they have to move on a flat surface. It's actually kind of a curve that it can follow. I have that on both hands, and you can also see that I'm doing a thing with my thumbs over here, such that if my hand is kind of resting here, my thumb can very easily move to this button, which is kind of nice and tilted as well. And your first inclination might be, well, why is that useful? It depends a bit on what you're used to. Like, if you're used to a normal keyboard like this, that is row staggered, that is to say, this is the straight line on the keyboard, it doesn't move in a column fashion. If I were to apply the tilting on this keyboard, it would make a little bit less sense, because my finger really wants to move forward and backward here. And by introducing this key well, my finger technically has to travel less. And the easiest way to show you is to just unplug 2 of these. There we go. We're going to put these back like this. So when I really put it on top like this, you can't see the difference. But hopefully when I put an angle down, you are going to notice that, the middle row over here is just flat. And if I were now to sort of move my finger from the D all the way up to the number, if you look at the distance that is needed to travel there, if I really keep my hand set with my thumb over here, like I'm constraining it a bit, but you can really see that it's going to be kind of an arch to get to that button. Like I really have to arch my finger over something. And if I were to move a little bit here to the right, I would still have to do a bit of an arch, but I would hit this button way quicker before I hit that one. So the whole idea behind this tilting kit is you just move the buttons a bit closer to where your finger is. And the way you do that is you introduce a bit of height and you introduce a bit of an angle. So hopefully this is somewhat clear to see. You can see that there's this spot at the bottom here. That's what you put inside the switch. And then the top here is basically something that you can put on the keycap. So just to give the quickest installation demo, there's an angle here and there's a little bit of extra height. You put this bit in here. This goes onto the MX key switch, and you repeat. And then this is basically the same idea, just that this one has a fair bit more height. You just put it in. And you click it in like so. I've been playing around with this for a while, and I have found that it is slightly more comfortable to type on. What's interesting mainly is the distance from your resting position of your hand to whatever button you want to press. Like, that's just kind of shorter, and I did not expect that, but it's actually, I would argue, a little bit more comfortable to type on this way. That's not to say that there aren't any downsides with this tilting kit, though. One thing I will say is that it does introduce this extra dimension of, oh, I got to figure that out. Like, besides just figuring out the switches that you like, you can also now figure out the 3D aspect of it. So like the search space of your perfect keyboard just kind of explodes. But there's also like a more subtle thing. You should be able to see, but there's like a couple of buttons down here. And I'm just going to give it a bit of force. And you can see that there's barely any wobble. And that's because these two keycaps are just immediately onto the switch. But now notice if I were to sort of put a little bit of force here and here, you know, there's actually a little bit of wobble. If you pay attention to it, you can definitely notice it. And it also makes sense because the switch now has a way longer arm, so the odds of it wobbling a bit also increase. So if you're very sensitive to that, like that is a thing you will notice. It has a longer arm now, so it is going to wobble a bit. Another thing to also keep in the back of your mind is that this doesn't work on every switch. You'll want to have a switch that basically has this one pin on top where the socket can sort of just wrap around. If you have a switch that's kind of like this, where there's something around the plus mark, then the system won't work anymore. Partially because, depending on the switches you've got, some of these switches have like a little millimeter of extra height. That's like a plug that you can put on. But if you have a box switch like this one, and it wraps all around it, there's no way to retrieve that millimeter back. So be aware that this system won't work on every single switch out there. Another thing that's also fair to mention is that if you ever want to swap the switches, that is now just going to be way more annoying because you are going to have to not just swap the switches and the keycaps, but also all the stuff in the middle. And you got to keep track of which pole you put where. And finally, like, if you can manage the wobble and if you're not going to switch the switches, another thing that I do think is also safe to say is that you do have these curved keyboards like the Glove 80, which is a great keyboard. And it might feel like when you do something like this, that you might get closer to it. And in a way you do because the travel is less, but it doesn't necessarily compare in terms of typing comfort. Like a proper keywell keyboard, if it fits your hand very nicely, that will just always be more comfortable than this. I think that this can be an upgrade given the right board, but we shouldn't compare this to the Glove 80 or something like that. That's just not a fair comparison at all. It is, however, still pretty fun, and I guess that's also the thing I kind of like about this Lily, because it's not necessarily a vendor keyboard. It is something that is meant by and for hackers a bit. You are also just a little bit more invited to toy around and really do experimental stuff. And there's like, if you go on Reddit, you'll find like huge communities of people that just share great ideas and stuff. And that just kind of made this a fun little keyboard to have in my rotation. It also has some good ergonomic aspects to it, like because it's columnar, you do have less like wrist movements and stuff. What I have found, if you do this tilting thing, you do need proper palm pads because the keyboard is a bit higher now. One thing I also think might be cool is like if you were to do like tenting and stuff, the fact that you've got an angle to the key over here, that just might make it easier to press for your thumb as well, because your thumb really likes to like move inward when it exerts force. So there's all sorts of cool stuff to explore with this. Like I'm still having a lot of fun with it. But maybe what I should do now is just kind of show you what it's like to type on this thing. And also to show you the configuration software. Before we get to that, I'm now going to plug in this board. With this board in particular, and lots of hobby boards have that, you have to take this cable and make sure that both halves are connected properly, like make sure it's properly connected, before you actually put power in. There's a small chance it might short circuit if you don't, so you always want to be safe with that. But okay, just to do a typing test, this is a pretty neat typing experience. Should not type too fast. It might feel a bit strange at first, but that tilting, it is super fun and it fits a hacking keyboard nicely! Exclamation point. So yeah, the sound, of course, that'll be different if you have different switches in it, but as you might have seen, like my fingers really like to move up and down, and there's not a whole lot of this happening all the time. Sometimes my index finger will move on this side, sometimes my pinky finger will move on that side, but that's really about it. One thing that it might be also good to mention is that this is a keyboard that has homebrew mods installed, and I'm just mentioning that in case you've never seen that before. The philosophy is that I really want to keep my hands on the center and not have to move it unless I really have to. And you might wonder, well, what do you do with Shift? And what do you do with Alt and those sorts of buttons? The resting position for my index finger, that's an F and the J. If I keep J pressed down and then hit a letter, that's a capital letter. And the same thing with F, and then if I have a letter on the other hand, those are capital letters. The whole point is that Shift, Command, Alt, and Control, those are all on the home row over here. If I keep a finger pressed down, then I trigger the modifier. If I just tap it, then I just trigger a normal key press, as I would normally. And each of these buttons can be programmed, and that also offers for a nice little flexible typing experience. So what I'll go ahead and do is just show you the configuration software for this. All right, and here's what the software looks like. This is VIAL, by the way. You go to vial.rocks. It is just a website, and then via web USB, you can flash all the software you like on this thing. And here you can just really see the layout of all the buttons. So backspace is on the pinky over here instead of somewhere on top over here. This button over here is space, and this button over here triggers a modifier. So that basically makes sure that when I hit this down, there's like a little arrow cluster over here. All that good stuff takes a lot of training, but that's the way this is configured. I'm not going to go too much in depth into what this configuration software can do. The main thing that's important is that you can totally remap keys and that you're actually quite flexible when it comes to configuration here. So one thing that you can see here is that I have this thing called a TD on this D button over here. That's short for tap dance. So tap dance button number 2. And here you can see that on tap, I trigger D. On hold, I trigger L GUI, which is command on Mac. And I can also configure the tapping term. So how long do I need to keep that button pressed down in order for it to trigger a tap or a hold? Being able to configure all that is definitely super duper nice. But I should also mention there's support for macros. So if you want to have keyboard shortcuts and stuff that run in sequence, you can configure that. There's also this thing called combos where on any part of the keyboard, if you have 2 buttons pressed down together, then that might trigger something else. So maybe Q and P is escape. Like, these are things you can configure relatively easily. And yeah, VIAL is pretty common software. It's built on top of this thing called QMK, which comes with these boards. You can also choose to really go down the rabbit hole and do the whole programming thing with QMK. But I will say just having this is super nice. You can just click something together real quick. And I was able to get up to speed relatively quickly as well because of it. So that's a lot of cool stuff about this keyboard. Some things that I have found with this keyboard is that I don't actually use all the buttons all the time. It's nice to have 2 buttons that are very comfortable to reach with your thumb, but you're still left with like these 3 buttons. I haven't really found an amazing use case for them just yet. It's cool to have extra buttons. It's just that, yeah, I don't really use it. I guess if you're interested in like doing things with that sort of keycap tilting kit, be aware that it can be like an extra $50 in total. I remember ordering this bag with these extensions, and customs actually made me pay import duties on it, which was another $11. But I guess the main thing that is cool to mention here is that if you're willing to maybe have your soldering be done by a hobbyist, and if you don't mind the fact that, you know, it's a bit more of a hobby keyboard. It's not like a AAA company made like a big mold or anything. Like if I were to compare it to this this knock-free keyboard that I've got, then you can notice that it's got like a very nice finish on the plastic case, and you don't see any of the soldering or the welding. And here, part of the aesthetic is that you can actually see that there's places where this thing has been soldered. You can also have a sort of little hacker screen that pops up whenever you plug the thing in. In general, I do think one thing that's really cool about this is, especially if you can find it on Marktplaats, again, shout out to Mepsky, who soldered this thing for me. This can actually be a great way as an introduction to the hobby. A lot of the vendors do make a lot of cool keyboards, but they also tend to be a lot more expensive. And I think in total, with all the tilting kits and switches and everything, this was maybe $200. And at that price, I do think it's a pretty cool intro to the hobby if you're interested in exploring these columnar, more ergonomic keyboards yourself. So I like the fact that it's more affordable. I like the fact that it's a bit more tinkerable. VIAL is pretty good software. It's not necessarily the best software, but it gets a lot of this stuff done. There are some quirks that I have found with VIAL in terms of getting the timing just right. Some of that depends on the switches that you pick as well. But all in all, I do think I'm going to have me some more fun with this this keycap tilting kit. I am pleasantly surprised in terms of the travel distance. It does feel like a more comfortable keyboard to type on. Even though you do notice the wobble, especially on the taller keys over here. But yeah, part of the hobby. This is pretty fun.